Welcome to the latest episode of Rounds Rants, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Robert Malone, who is an American physician and biochemist. His early work focused on the mRNA vaccine, and recently Robert has appeared on other podcasts such as Joe Rogan and the Rubin Report while speaking out against elements of the COVID vaccine and other issues regarding government policies around that. So, Robert, thanks a million for taking time out to come on the show. And firstly, how are you getting on today?
Good. It's a lovely day here in Virginia. A lot of sunshine. We're starting to just see springtime creep in. The grass is getting a little bit greener. We've got four foals on the ground and one still in the oven. So everything's looking up.
Good stuff. And yeah, it's a rarity here in Dublin. We can say that the weather is pretty good. Sun is out, sun is shining, no wind, no rain. So we'll take it. And yeah, so before we maybe delve into more contemporary topics that you've covered as of late, just for some of the listeners who are maybe new to your work, obviously you've been working in, science and medicine for a very long period of time, but what made you get into like medicine, science in the first place? Like, were you a young child when you got into it? Was it college? What made you gravitate towards that area?
That's a good question. I was originally a carpenter and a farmhand. Worked orchards, lemons and avocados, and did rough out framing and shingling and that kind of stuff. Still rehab buildings. We're in the middle of a couple of barns, and this is an old pig barn. Actually, it's now the recording studio. I did a lot of the build out and framing and the parging of the cinder block walls. This was built in 45. I decided when I was a young man that I didn't want to do carpentry my whole life. I had a young wife and really wanted to see what I could do with myself. And at the time in the late 70s, early 80s, the idea of getting into medical school was crazy talk. It was insanely difficult, a true system based on merit and achievement. And I was already a bent arrow. I was coming out of a community college and just bootstrapping my way up. But my mom had always kind of put into my brain that in her ideal world, I would be a physician. And my wife's parents really became my mentors and took care of me and encouraged it. And so I took the path of saying, well, the probability that I would get into medicine was pretty low. I had spent 2 years as a computer science student, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in a dark room looking at a computer monitor. This is early 80s, and so I like to joke that now I sit and look at a computer monitor, but I make about 1/10 of what I had made if I had stayed in computer science in the early 80s. So it goes. We make our decisions.
Yeah.
And when I was an undergraduate, I sought out an opportunity to learn bench research and worked for a pathologist that eventually became chair of the department, who had just come out of a fellowship with Bishop and Varmus, which were Nobel Prize winners at UC San Francisco for the discovery of the oncogene story. And so it was a pretty high-powered environment. He took me in, and I was good at it. I worked really hard. I brought the work ethic that I had always had from my time as a carpenter and a farmhand, and I just worked hard at it and kind of exceeded my own expectations. They wrote me a really good letter, and I got a MD PhD scholarship at Northwestern. So I kind of overshot the mark, but that's what got me here as the starting point. And I had a real passion for science. I believed that science, and particularly molecular biology and virology, was a a brave new world, a new opportunity to really be at the forefront. I'm a person who thrives on being out at the edge. I'm not a follower. I like to kind of strike my own path, and and there aren't that many places left in the world where you can do that. But at the forefront of science is one of them. Unfortunately, science isn't the pure thing that I had hoped it was or believed it was at the time, but that's another part of the story.
Yeah. And was it during that period that you kind of studied and assessed, and as you've said on previous podcasts, that's where you came to the conclusion, came to the findings about the mRNA kind of technology around the potential vaccine that was, produced several
So
years later?
they
Was that the
my
time?
time as an undergrad was in a laboratory that was right at the forefront of AIDS and AIDS research and retroviral research, and they pivoted to focusing on vaccine development. So that's kind of where I first wet my toes in vaccinology and also in the preparation and purification and manipulation of RNA. After 2 years of medical school, I wanted to do graduate work back on the West Coast. My wife was not happy in Chicago. We both grew up in Santa Barbara, so that was kind of an abrupt shock.
Yeah.
And I found the science wasn't at the level that I was used to. So I took my graduate exams, nailed them, and was able to go pretty much wherever I wanted to go. And the best place to do gene therapy, which at the time was all about retroviruses, was at UC San Diego in the Salk Institute. And so they took me in, and that's where I really worked on trying to answer questions about the structure and function of RNA as it assembles into retroviruses. And in order to do that, I had to invent some new technology. And inadvertently, that ended up being uh, the really the birth of non-viral gene delivery and the birth and initial realization that you could use RNA as a drug, and then the insight that gene therapy was not going to work because a child's immune system doesn't know that it's a good gene. It only knows that it's a different protein. And so it will attack cells that are expressing, let's say, a proper cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator or dystrophin protein. And so gene therapy clearly wasn't going to work, was one of my unfortunate insights. And so if that's the case, what can you do with a relatively inefficient gene therapy technology like mRNA delivery? And the easy answer for me was use it to produce a vaccine response because the immune system amplifies the biologic response. And so that's what gave birth to the idea and the concept. And then it was reduced to practice at the Salk in terms of the delivery, and then at Vical in terms of demonstrating that it could be used for vaccines.
Okay. And you then fast forward all these years, we've everyone on planet Earth now knows what a vaccine is, or maybe not in depth, maybe as perhaps you would or other professionals would. But what I find interesting about you, you've got an extensive background in science in the medical industry. You've had your ear to the ground from, as you were saying, like 80s, 90s, etc. A lot of people now are growing to know what these huge pharmaceutical companies, what these governments are associated with when it comes to, as I said, these huge pharmaceutical companies. And in your country, America, no matter how far back you look, there are lawsuits, there's corruption, there is maybe a lack of trust when it comes to the public towards these huge pharmaceutical companies that now obviously are backing a lot of these vaccinations being passed around. How has, not necessarily your opinion, but what you've seen from growing up and working in the industry and very close to the industry, do you feel like over the last 20, 30 years, these pharmaceutical companies and in turn maybe the government have lost trust? Or is it only really recently with COVID that this awareness and this lack of trust has kind of developed?
So you have to be careful because we're all in a bubble. Uh, and there's a recent poll out here in the United States suggesting that the pharmaceutical industry is still among the most trusted in the United States on average. Has despite the many fines for fraud and other activities levied against Pfizer, I mean, one of the biggest criminal penalties in history in the United States was levied against Pfizer, and yet the public still trusts them. So that's a paradox, and I think it is a clear demonstration of the power of modern marketing. Which then bleeds into the power of modern psyops, really, which is a related field. Uh, so I don't know that your base assumption that the pharmaceutical industry is mistrusted is actually correct. It's not necessarily valid, except among those that have our eyes open and we're awake. How has the last 3 years increased hesitancy or wariness about the pharmaceutical industry and the vaccine segment in general? Yeah, you can see that indirectly in aspects like the uptake of childhood vaccines in general, which is plummeting, and the uptake of these COVID vaccines into children, which has been very low in the less than 15%, and the uptake of these boosters into the general population, which is also less than 15%. So we really have a minority of the population that trusts in the sense that they are willing to accept these products, these vaccine products that are basically genetic therapy based. Uh, Despite the various mandates and propaganda and compulsion and incentives, et cetera, that have been deployed to um, uh, manufacture willingness to accept the products. The So things have changed. They're still a long ways though from universal or even majority of the population having the degree of skepticism that I think is warranted, and you probably do also. In terms of myself and my peers, for many of us, this has been an awakening. Uh, I've always been aware that there were corrupt aspects of the FDA and its relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, and the CDC with its relationship with the vaccine industry. Any of these federal agencies that have dual roles, where they are both promoting an industry and regulating it, are prone to this type of capture and corruption. But I don't think I've been through many, many outbreaks. I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen the globally coordinated propaganda and psyops. I've never seen activities like the wholesale purchasing of influencers and artists and comedians and musicians all over the world simultaneously, or certainly the Western world. That's new to me. The coordination of the censorship is also stunning. Whether whatever you think of the necessity for the 77th Brigade or whomever to deploy military grade psyops on the general population to get them to accept these experimental products, whatever your thoughts are about that, I think you have to concede that it has been enormously successful in a kind of a sick, twisted way. Uh, we're now in a position where the concept of individual sovereignty is even really compromised. I mean, how can you have sovereignty in decision making when you're having military grade propaganda weaponized against you with the goal of controlling your thoughts and emotions, not just the content that you see, but what you think and believe. That's what's been done, and so people think they have free will, but they're being very actively manipulated. It's stunning what the Western governments have agreed to and participated in, and there in Ireland, you have a long history of being very familiar with what the UK is willing to do,
Absolutely.
and uh, the idea of ethics and guardrails and what's acceptable behavior and what isn't acceptable behavior with a civilian population, it just all seems grossly obsolete these days. It's an anachronism. It's total information warfare with no boundaries.
Yeah. And yeah, no, as you said there, like Ireland, we were, when you looked and compared us to the rest of Europe, we were as strict and as hardcore when it came to lockdowns and measurements that one country could be. So we felt the full blow, so to speak, of restrictions and lockdowns, and it still even is a topic of discussion today. If you turn on the radio or you turn on the news, it's still something that is constantly being questioned. But to nearly rewind back to the nearly the beginning of the pandemic, when on that fateful day in November, what was it, 2019, the first case of COVID came to the fore and the panic started to gather, no matter what way you looked at it. A big thing you've discussed about was the rollout of the vaccine and the different maybe precautions that needed to be covered that weren't, certain steps that were skipped. I do understand that it was a time sensitive like situation. There was a lot of pressure on people, governments, as I said, livelihoods, everything. But like, what are your, now that we have hindsight in our back pocket, what are the maybe the biggest concerns or criticisms you would have had of the vaccine rollout? And if you could have changed something and gone back in time, what would it have been?
Well, of course, the thing that really initially radicalized me and that I spoke out about was the bioethics of what was being done. That people were being compelled and coerced and propagandized into accepting an experimental medical product without adequate informed consent is shocking. The willingness to do that on the part of Western governments is stunning. It's very much aligned with the Chinese model of basically shut up and do what you're told. And it's fascinating to me in retrospect that it was the Five Eyes nations, in particular, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, being Great Britain, UK, US, New Zealand, and Australia, that had some of the most egregiously authoritarian policies of the entire world. I mean, we could argue about Austria and maybe some of the other EU countries, but for the most part, it was this Five Eyes alliance, former Commonwealth associated countries that became extremely regressive, authoritarian in a way that was completely unexpected. I'm still stunned to see what has happened in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, for example. And so, what do we make of this? We're now in a different relationship, I think, with the government, with the nation state. And of course, underpinning all of this is the new belief system that uh, the obstacle to successful centrally controlled economies has been the lack of sufficient data and algorithmic analysis, and that if we only had enough data on every single person, then we could eliminate crime, optimize resource allocation, optimize production, minimize threats to the environment, and basically create a workers' paradise in a centralized command economy run by unelected, self-appointed global leaders that happen to have won the lottery in terms of how much money they have and how much power they control. It's I recently was in the UK speaking to a conservative group about Andrew Bridgen, who's been run out of the Conservative Party, And I learned there something I hadn't known before, that basically the leadership of the European Union is unelected. I found that stunning. Uh, it is absolutely mirroring what the World Economic Forum seems to be promoting for all of us, is that we should live under centralized authority in a command economy environment with unelected leaders that basically represent the interests of industry, calling the shots. And I don't want to live in that world. I don't think you probably want to live in that world. And these people believe that it's appropriate for them to shape, their own words, a future of transhumanism in which God is obsolete, man has substituted himself for God. Uh, um, the fourth industrial revolution will happen, and it will result in the fusion of man and machine, and we will pass through a singularity to really make human beings as a species obsolete and transition to some new entity. This is bizarre thinking. It's very reminiscent of uh, the thinking that we've seen in the past that we've called Marxism uh, or Marxism-Leninism. It's very much grounded in utilitarianism and the logic that we have limited resources here on the world, and our only way forward is going to be through some sort of a population control agenda. I think that most of us have seen those movies, whether it's Mad Max or it's The Matrix, and all of the things in between. And of course, many of us have read the literature of George Orwell and Brave New World and all the other, Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, uh, the work of William Gibson. It's we've seen this dark dystopia projected in fiction. I don't think we have to live it to recognize the flaws within it.
And what you say is it's kind of based on an overall experience, but especially when you really focus on the last 2 to 3 years, you realize the power, as you said nearly, of the narrative and these marketing journeys they've gone on and the control of the media. And you're the first guest I've had on to date for all the wrong reasons, that there's been attacks on you, you've been kicked off Twitter. Thankfully, you've been allowed back on and thriving. But at what stage during it? So I'll give you my example. For instance, when during COVID, I thought, hang on, this doesn't make sense. Where I went to the doctor, I was a bit sick, I tested for COVID, I came back negative, and I was speaking to him. I'm also type 1 diabetic, so I'm high risk regardless of what the illness is. And he was telling me that maybe I should consider going to hospital. But the worry was, if you went to hospital a lot of the time, you'd get COVID because it was so rampant in these places. And he then said that his daughter had gone in for surgery and stayed overnight. And while she was there, it was going to be 2 or 3 days recovery. She picked up COVID in the hospital, and then she was being treated as a COVID patient. And then, therefore, when it comes to the analytical point of view, she's another hospitalization due to COVID, and she also wasn't vaccinated. So that's another stat that gets pinned to the board. And I was thinking, she's in there for surgery. She's not in there because of COVID. Yes, when the argument comes to the table, she's going to go down as an unvaccinated COVID person who ended up in hospital. And I was thinking that just isn't right. Yet I'm reading it on the front page of the Irish Times or whatever paper I choose to pick up in the shop the following day. But at what point for you, maybe it was when you saw the vaccine rolled out and you read the ins and outs of it, but at what stage of, say, the COVID pandemic did you have serious concerns, whether it's about the government, whether it's about the vaccine, whether it's about the lockdowns? Like, at what stage did that come to you?
That would be about March 2020, when the book that my wife had put out about preparing and protecting yourself from the novel coronavirus, it didn't even have a name at the time when she published it in the beginning of February 2020. was deplatformed by Amazon without any appeal. And after much back and forth, we learned that the rationale was that we had violated community standards, which there was no indication of what those community standards are, and they wouldn't tell us. They wouldn't tell us anything further. That's when I knew that, metaphorically referring to the Wizard of Oz, we were no longer in Kansas. That things were just not right. The subsequent events, as I spent a year and a half working closely with the Department of Defense to repurpose drugs, and we ran into all kinds of barriers on the part of the FDA to proceed with well-funded, randomized, well-designed clinical trials that included ivermectin, for example. They just wouldn't let us move forward unless we proved the mechanism of action of ivermectin for COVID using cell culture, which is pretty much an absurd statement, particularly for a licensed drug well known to be safe. And we were working with other previously repurposed, previously licensed drugs that were known to be safe under those conditions, including celecoxib and famotidine. There shouldn't have been these barriers. And the team that was working for DoD together with me were a bunch of really seasoned white hairs. We'd been through many, many INDs and clinical protocols and drug development programs. None of us had ever seen anything like it before. Then there was the use of propaganda to coerce and compel people to take these products down to the level of giving children ice cream cones to get them to take the jab in Canada, which I found shocking. And for an unlicensed, experimental product, absolutely stunning. And the actions of Mr. Trudeau, the common technical document that Byron Bridle, this Canadian vaccinologist, had discovered on a Japanese server, of which I was one of the first to analyze, in which I could see that the proper studies according to the well-accepted norms, international norms, had not been performed. All of these
And what do
things,
they look like, those studies?
all of these things demonstrated to me that just something wasn't right. Now I'm going to just take a moment and turn up my monitor because you have such a soft voice. I'm not catching you very well. One moment.
No worries.
Yeah, hopefully that's much better here. I need to turn it down a little bit. I don't want to get feedback.
Yeah.
A lot of things, a whole cascade of things, I refer to it as not really that I was red-pilled by a specific event, but rather a whole cascade of things that gradually built and built and built.
And when you mentioned there about the concerns that you read, like around, say, for instance, the release of the vaccine, like you've gone on and stated that to do the proper testing to qualify the drug, it takes several years. And like, do you propose that should have been the bare minimum to say that this product, this vaccine is 100%, well, not 100%, but as close to 100% foolproof as possible? Or like, what would you've, in an ideal world, looked for out of these vaccine companies to do before they obviously formulated a
Well, they
plan
should
to
have
put
followed
in
the
some-
rules. And the regulatory agencies should have forced them to follow the rules. Now, the tension in all of this comes out, just if I can illustrate. Let's imagine that instead of SARS-CoV-2, which turns out to be not very lethal at all, let's imagine that we're talking about a aerosol transmitted Ebola virus, just for the sake of argument. Not that that exists. But there have been scenarios worked up for what a aerosol transmitted Ebola virus might do to the global population. And those scenarios come out at something like 1 billion people dead. Now, if we had had a pathogen like that, people would be lining up to take a partially effective and somewhat toxic vaccine. In fact, the Ebola vaccine that I worked on and then transferred to Merck, that was originally developed by Public Health Agency Canada, is actually a pretty nasty vaccine. You feel like somebody has beaten you up. Maybe your metaphor is you just come out of a really tough rugby game if you take that vaccine, and yet if you're facing the prospect of having Ebola, you'll line up to take it. It's a risk-benefit ratio. In this case, they promoted this and really forced it into the population as if we were facing something with the risk profile akin to aerosol transmitted Ebola. But it was absolutely nowhere near that pathogenic. Now, part of that was the consequence early on of active fear and propaganda that was promoted from China to the West. That cannot be disputed. The images of people dying on the streets and Chinese officials in full hazmat suits and the rapid build out of the hospital and all the discussion about how the hospitals were all filled up. That was all Chinese propaganda, and it was weaponized by actors who it's not really clear who was really behind it, and used to not only instill fear in the population, but instill fear into politicians who felt like they had no other options other than to cut short the development process and try to rush this vaccine out. That was another one of the false stories that were told, when in fact, very early on, we knew that there were a variety of repurposed agents which, if administered early, would save lives. Something like 98% of lives or more could have been saved with early treatment using available agents. So there were multiple lies stacked up that resulted in the tragedy that we've all experienced. Should the vaccines have been deployed rapidly? I think that is clear in retrospect that rushing and circumventing normal processes to ensure safety, including rigorous clinical trials with well-controlled data and a control group that didn't get eliminated right away, would have allowed us to make sense out of many of the things that have happened subsequently and to predict the risks and to better tune who should be receiving these products and who shouldn't. But none of that was done in this mad rush to push these things out the door. And I think that deserves a lot of scrutiny as to why that happened and how that happened, and whether there was undue influence on the part of large pharmaceutical companies on decision-making at the National Health Service and the US HHS and European Medicines Agency, et cetera. That I think absolutely has to be done. There has to be investigations, and people have to be held accountable. And there really should be consequences for the actions that were taken that were illegal or highly inappropriate. From my point of view, it's unequivocal. The products were rushed. It was not necessary. There were other options that would have been more appropriate for public health. It has never been the case that these mandates, lockdowns, etc., should be imposed. The literature on mask use for respiratory viruses has been fairly clear for quite a long time. These paper masks, which are really just dust particle masks, are not effective. An N95 might be slightly effective if it's used properly, except for the fact that this coronavirus also infects by your eyes. And last I checked, we weren't walking around with masks covering our eyes. So all of that logic was flawed. The 6 foot distancing was purely arbitrary. That's been documented now. It was basically a conversation, including the director of our CDC, Bob Redfield, that basically, to the gentlest way to put it, is they pulled it out of a hat. Uh, um, it has no scientific basis. All of these measures were put in place in a haphazard, arbitrary, and capricious manner, and had enormous costs. The masking of our children, in terms of educational delays and developmental delays, the damage to our economies, the damage to the Irish economy has been profound. And with that, with the lockdowns, the social isolation, the depression, suicide, drug abuse, a whole cascade of badness came out of that was absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah, yeah. Even speaking locally, I remember the early suicide rates weren't released during COVID. There was, as I said, so many businesses. I even knew business owners myself that had to close as a result of the just countless lockdowns when the rest of Europe had pretty much opened up. And as you mentioned there was a lot of messaging that was pushed out, and whether it was coming from our media or the US media or the UK media, a big one was like, you need to be vaccinated in order to have the highest like immunity towards COVID. And I've only just read there in the last week that, tests and studies have shown that like immunity acquired from COVID itself is, on par or even better than doses of the
Yeah,
vaccine.
that's fascinating that you say that, because it's been known for quite a long time.
Because would I be right in saying that was one of the big reasons, like the uproar of you and Joe Rogan kind of happened? I remember at the time people were just saying that simply wasn't true, yet now everywhere worldwide is reporting it to be true.
Yeah, that and these words, mask formation, psychosis, and so many other things. The perverse financial incentives to hospitals in the United States to overreport. Just a lot of things that I said there. I was attacked, particularly by the British press, for saying, and have pretty much become accepted wisdom in the subsequent year. So I take a certain amount of vindication out of that, but no pleasure. I wish it wasn't true. I wish things. Uh, um, I wish that we had not had this misrepresentation and propaganda and all that. But it is what it is.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to ask about the vaccine, because as I've said, you know a lot more about this type of stuff than me, and it's what I have conversations with my family about, my friends, people I work with, is the vaccine itself, that whether it was lies, whether it was the truth, whether it's different strains, because there has been multiple. Like I've had 3 different strains of COVID over the last pretty much 3 years, and they've all been fluctuating in how they've affected me, so to speak. But how is it the case where a vaccine has basically deteriorated with time? So whether it's false reporting or just reactionary based onto the strains, at the start it was like high 80% or even 90% against protection against COVID and the symptoms, to now it's in some
Yeah,
cases like
a lot of
18%.
that was artifacts and falsehoods based on how they were reporting the data, uh, and really statistical artifacts. Those high numbers were really a question of playing with numbers creatively to get those kinds of percentages. The um, In a recent paper, Tony Fauci published in one of the Cell associated publications, he acknowledged that this type of a vaccine never had a chance to get out ahead of the evolution of the virus and to be effective. It wasn't being, the virus infects in your nasal pharynx, it doesn't affect systemically in the same way. And so you really need a mucosal vaccine, in theory, he argues, I concur. But so it's been known that this strategy was unlikely to work, and yet it was pushed by people who really didn't understand what they were talking about, including journalists pretended to be scientists.
There's a
And
lot of them.
yeah, there's awful lot of that. Journalists that don't really understand what they're talking about, but they say it very loudly. I'm reminded of the joke about the characteristics of a surgeon, often wrong but never in doubt, and that seems to be the case with journalists too. Uh, and so the underlying there's a couple of underlying issues. One is that the universal deployment of a vaccine into an ongoing outbreak with all the viral pressure associated with that is pretty much a perfect recipe for selecting for escape mutant viruses that are resistant to the response that the vaccine generates. So generally, you don't want to do that. You want to vaccinate before an outbreak so that you never get this massive viral pressure on the whole population, because it's just a recipe for failure when that happens, particularly with an RNA virus that mutates very rapidly by its very nature as a single-stranded RNA virus. In addition to that, there's a long-standing problem that's plagued influenza vaccinology, which is basically a forbidden topic among vaccinologists in public. The literature is there, but it's another one of these things we don't talk about because it's an inconvenient truth. And that is that if you repeatedly vaccinate, you basically generate something called immune imprinting. And that is, you can think of it as a form of memory in which your immune system is focused on responding to things that are increasingly irrelevant, either because the virus is mutated or they're epitopes that are not critical, or a number of other phenomena. You can focus your immune response on yesterday's virus, which is what's been going on with the COVID shots. So immune imprinting seems to be part of it. And the FDA had originally warned about the prospects of antibody-dependent enhancement. That was actually in a lot of the initial licensing discussions and documentation from the FDA, and they had demanded that the pharmaceutical companies do experiments to demonstrate that this would not happen because it's plagued all prior human coronavirus vaccine development efforts. And then there was a period of time where it was believed that antibody-dependent enhancement wasn't happening because of some nuances of this virus not being able to replicate in macrophage. But then there's been more recent studies demonstrating that a related pathway, somewhat different, is being antibody enhanced. So we basically have multiple mechanisms by which the jabs are damaging the immune system in a variety of different ways, and not only setting it up so that you're more likely to get COVID or get the significant disease or death if you take multiple of these products due to direct damage and these indirect immunologic phenomena. But also, as the more you take them, the more likely you are to get the adverse events associated with taking them, such as the myocarditis. And so, what the leading members of the US government called hope that these products would be safe and effective, rather than basing their decisions on data, has unfortunately proven to be a false hope. And all over the world, we've had people that have been damaged or died unnecessarily because of the toxicity associated with these products, both in terms of the protein that is produced. Spike is a toxin. Another thing I was criticized for saying, but is now self-evident. And the formulations themselves are toxic. That can be seen, for instance, in the failure of the phase 3 trials of Moderna's influenza vaccine that has just been announced. So that's a product that doesn't produce spike, and yet it's still so toxic that it fails to be allowed to proceed to licensure. So that's the inconvenient, unfortunate truth of where we're at right now. Is the governments, in their rush and their fear, and frankly their cowardice and corruption, have forced things onto the general population that were counterproductive, that made things worse, from the lockdowns to the masks to the school closures to the many of the drugs that were promoted, to withholding early treatment, and then, of course, to the jabs themselves.
Interesting. And one thing I'd like to ask, and with everything you read about COVID or everything you've seen over the last 2 to 3 years, one thing that really sparked my interest was, as you've said countless times in this podcast, like a lot of this is down to science. And what I agree with science is that, say, for instance, if you mix two chemicals, you're going to get the same reaction every single time because that's how science is. It's consistent. No matter what way you dress it up, it's more or less going to be consistent with the outcome at the end of the day. But you read a lot of, say, the US media, when they post some of these crazy headlines, and they can be pro or anti-vaccine, they can be pro-COVID or anti-COVID, a lot of things seem to be the result of what is known as observational data as opposed to scientific data. And I was just wondering if, in, say, the case of COVID, or when it comes to the vaccine, like when someone is saying based on our observational data, like what does that actually mean? Like, is that just me looking at
I
you and
think you may
saying,
be misinterpreting that a little bit. Um, uh, and it's worth learning about the pyramid of data hierarchy in medicine in making determinations about these things. Case histories in which there's a physician observing a given case is actually the foundation upon which medicine is built, but it's very prone to bias. And so what's typically done is physicians may observe something and typically report it. For instance, a physician may say, I'm seeing more cancers. I'm seeing cancers in popping back up in people that were previously thought to be cured, and after they take the jab, suddenly their cancer comes back. Okay, that could easily be an artifact of a bias on the part of the observer, the pathologist. So then once you have those signals, the next thing you have to do is more rigorous studies. And there's a cascade of rigor from a case series, which is a collection of these cases, and you examine them to see if there's commonality, all the way up to a randomized clinical trial. And then even above a randomized clinical trial is a meta-analysis in which you look at a compendium of trials and examine those statistically. That's even more powerful, but it's a little tricky. And so that's the way science works, is you start from somebody saying, I think I see something, but I'm not sure, and it might be due to this, all the way up to definitively testing. And this gets into evidence-based medicine, is the modern logic that we should only make decisions based on fully validated information. And again, that fails when you're facing an outbreak like this, a crisis. And so the way that has typically things have proceeded in medicine historically has been that physicians operate through trial and error to a significant extent, using the agents that they have available in their own minds. And that's what happened with the various discoveries of the early treatment protocols. But to then take those early treatment protocols and rigorously test them in a randomized clinical trial will typically take 1 to 2 or more years. And in the face of an outbreak like this, you don't really have that time. So that's why historically physicians have done this kind of observational research, which has a component of trial and error. And so that's why it's super important when you're doing that you provide informed consent. You say to the patient, okay, this is not yet a proven therapy. I think it will work because this, that, and the other reason. Here's the potential risks, which we know about these drugs and how they interact. And you can choose to take this or take the standard of care. And either way is fine with me. That's the way that should be presented. It's often not presented that way. Physicians usually have their own bias. And people that have come up with a treatment protocol often become very invested in it. Oh, it's my treatment protocol. You should take that because I'm a great physician or surgeon or whatever the thing is. So that's just the nature of human beings. But that's how things should have proceeded. And what's odd in this case is this imposition of requirements that people follow a standardized protocol developed by people, for instance, at the NIH, that don't actually treat patients. That's where we really went sideways. And then the logic that, well, we shouldn't have early treatment available because then that would dissuade people from taking a fully safe and effective vaccine. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that were baked into this, frankly, before the virus ever hit our shores. If you look at Event 201 and the preceding war game planning, they assumed that we would have a highly lethal pathogen and a fully safe and effective vaccine, that there wouldn't be any early treatment options from repurposed drugs, and that there would be civil unrest. And so based on those parameters, they came up with operational battle plans, functionally, that said that we were going to use the military and we were going to coerce, compel, propagandize to get the population to take these, even though they might not trust them and might not trust the government. And if they don't, we'll have to resort to heavy-handed tactics like billy clubs and suppressing protests and horses stomping on old women in wheelchairs, and et cetera, et cetera. That's kind of how this played out. Is there was a bunch of assumptions that were false, and they came up with plans. And like, I don't know if you've served. I'm sure many of your audience has in the military, but anyone who has and has been in any kind of a command position or taught about that knows that the first thing that goes out the window when you counter the enemy is your battle plan. You have to revise it immediately when you encounter what the ground truth is. And in this case, all across the world, they did not do that. And so that's either a major flaw and an indication of incompetence, or it's an indication that none of this had anything to do with public health. And that's the dilemma, is how do you differentiate between nefarious or malicious intent and gross incompetence? Because that's kind of where we're at right now. And it can be both. You can have gross incompetence and malicious intent at the same time. And I can't, I'm not at the bottom of it. I don't think I know what the answer is. And people who tell me they think they know, I'm usually pretty skeptical about, because whatever has been the hidden hands here behind all this coordination. I mean, you can't have this kind of global coordination without some entity controlling it. That's just too far-fetched. So what is that entity? Is it the Five Eyes Consortium? There's so many. Is it the WEF? Is it the bankers? We can go on and on and on about the speculation of who the nefarious actor was. Is it the CCP? Is it all the above, all acting together? Is it the monarchists, the historic monarchy of old Europe? I mean, I've heard so many different theories, but the bottom line is none of us really know. We can tell that there was something out there coordinating all this. There was some source of massive capital infusion early on to promote the purchasing of influencers and musicians and comedians and writers and reporters. We know that the U.S. government dropped at least $10 billion on that, but that doesn't account for what happened in Austria. That doesn't account for what happened in Ireland. It's hard to wrap your hands around what's transpired here. And I can't say, despite spending a year writing this book and trying to make sense out of these things and helping other people make sense out of them, I still am in the stage of describing what has happened and making some sense out of some layers. But what is going on behind the scenes and all this, I'm still clueless.
Well, hopefully in the not too distant future, it all becomes transparent and the like C. Montgomery Burns kind of evil leader
Yeah,
of
and
this
and
whole thing.
maybe there are unicorns and a Santa Claus.
Perhaps. Well, Robert, that more or less wraps it up. I'd obviously love to chat for hours, but I know you're on a tight schedule. But how we normally finish these podcasts is just with a quick few questions, quick fire questions,
Go.
and then I can send you on your way. So I'll kick straight into it. So, your favorite film of all time?
Casablanca,
Good choice.
but closely followed by Cloud Atlas.
Oh, Cloud Atlas, yeah, the Tom Hanks one. Yeah, probably need to see that again. It was like a 4 hour crazy
Yeah.
trip, but I'll probably review that soon. And what is worse, doing the dishes, hoovering the house, or changing the bed sheets?
Hoover in the house.
You're the first person to say that, but each to their own. The favorite book you've ever read?
Favorite book. That's a harder one. Um, I was really influenced by the trio of Death of Socrates, Brave New World, and 1984. But um, really, as a young person, just absolutely dove into the works of Shakespeare. I still really love Shakespearean theater. Um, I would say it's complicated because your tastes change over time. I was very influenced by Ayn Rand when I was younger. So I'd say layers of different books at different points in time.
Okay. So what's next? Your favorite song of all time?
Hmm. Favorite song. Um,
Or it could just be one at the moment you're kind of digging, so to speak.
no. Uh, American Pie, I think, has just got this uh, tugs at the heartstrings. A lot of, I used to be, my favorites were from the uh, early 70s, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Joni Mitchell, that kind of Laurel Canyon era. And then Neil Young came out after the Joe Rogan podcast, and now I can't even listen to those things anymore. And I would prefer to listen to um, some of the more edgy modern stuff. Um, so
Yeah, no, I get that. And second last one is cats or dogs?
dogs, but I'm a big horse fan. Uh, but we have three Aussies. I like cats too, but dogs are the thing.
Okay. And last question is, if you could ask yourself one question that I haven't asked you today, what would it be?
I'm surprised you didn't ask me about the better future ahead, and what can we do going forward to address things like the vaccine injured and those issues. So that would be that area.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my final point is like you obviously have that book on showcase behind you on the screen. Is there anything in particular, whether it's follow your socials or your book or any work you're doing at the moment that
Oh,
you
for
want the
that,
listeners?
for pumping things.
Yeah,
Uh,
pump away.
please, for if you want to catch our the work product for myself and my wife on a daily basis, and you don't have to pay. You can subscribe to rwmalonemd.substack.com, and it'll just come straight into your inbox via email. Although some of the Bill Gates products, for some reason, I have a tendency to route it into your junk mail. I just can't imagine why. Uh, so, um, uh, so Substack is a good one, and Truth Social, Gab, Getter, and of course Twitter at r2bmalonemd. And then for the real aficionados that are interested in things like the Young Leaders Program and who's graduated from that from the WEF and want to get into those documents, it's the Malone Institute. So that's maloneinstitute.org is a good website that we put a lot of the deeper stuff and the spreadsheets and those kind of things onto.
Super. Well, listen, Robert, I will attach all those links below. So anyone listening on YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, just look down if you're interested in any of that. And I just want to thank you for taking time out to have a chat. I know it's been several weeks in the making, but it was definitely worthwhile. And listen, I look forward to what comes next with yourself. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thanks. On to the next podcast. Be good, and thanks for taking the time.